What does the well-reasoned life look like? So far we know that we need to live a reasoned and well thought out life if we want to fulfill our human potential, be virtuous, and find happiness. But what does the reasoned or contemplative life look like for Aristotle? We know from Book 1, Chapter 1, that Aristotle does not think we can get absolute rules that apply without exception or without human error to ethics. But he does have a lot to say about what the well-reasoned life looks like. Book 1, Chapter 2 provides us with several radically influential descriptions of what reason will show us the good and virtuous life is like. His first formulation is this: every virtue is a mean between two extremes. The person living the well-lived or well-thought-out life will realize that the virtuous person will balance the extremes and avoid excess and avoid lack. Here Aristotle starts to give very practical examples which will make his point clear. Courage as a mean between two extremes. The first example he gives is courage, a virtue highly valued in Athens. We are used to saying that someone without enough courage suffers from cowardice. But for Aristotle, courage will be not just the opposite of some lack. Courage, for example, is overcoming cowardice, but also a mean which avoids an excess. What is the excess of the thing which, in moderation, is courage? Aristotle calls it foolhardiness. In other words, if I am too afraid to act at all, I may be considered a coward. But if I am so fearless that I act without even thinking about the consequences, then I am foolish rather than courageous. Imagine a soldier who decides to fight the enemy without any regard for the advice of his captain or the consequences of his acts. This person is certainly no coward, but we might not consider it to be a good example of the virtue of courage either. Virtue in attaining pleasure. A second example that Aristotle gives us is the virtue one has by responding to pleasure in the right way. In this case, it is easier for us to think of the failure which comes from excess rather than defect. Someone who indulges in too much pleasure is a hedonist and self-indulgent. We could probably think of a lot more names for people who like pleasure too much, especially for those who indulge in sexual pleasures. Our society has accepted that this is a moral failing. But is there a moral failing which comes from participating in pleasurable activities too little, from feeling too little pleasure? For Aristotle we know there must be, because every virtue is a mean between two extremes. But we certainly don't have as many names for someone who experiences too little pleasure. And while society today frequently criticizes people who indulge in too much pleasure, you will rarely hear someone criticized for feeling too little pleasure. The word prudish, though a bit old-fashioned, is probably the only word we can find for this defect. This example puts Aristotle in direct contrast with his teacher, Plato. Plato had highly emphasized the importance of denying bodily wants and pleasures so that we could seek only the higher spiritual things in life, such as absolute goodness, justice, and virtue. But for Aristotle, denying our bodies cannot be a virtue. Firstly, every virtue is a mean between two extremes, so the extreme of self-denial cannot itself be a virtue. Secondly, for Aristotle, reason is our highest and defining trait, but we are still rational animals, and the need of our animal soul must still be met, though of course within the bounds of reason. So continual and relentless self-denial cannot be a virtue for Aristotle. The mean or midpoint is not mathematical. Aristotle has already told us in Book 1 that ethics and virtue cannot be a pure science. It is a study and application of experience that is always relative to the human condition. Aristotle re-emphasizes this point here. We might think of the mean or midpoint, which defines a virtue in a purely mathematical sense. We might simply try to find the exact middle between complete excess and complete deprivation, and say that we have therefore found virtue. But Aristotle is not making this claim. Instead, he says in Book 2, Chapter 6, that the mean is always relative to the individual and the situation that the individual is in. The mean is relative to the situation. First, let's consider the mean relative to the situation. Where is the midpoint between cowardice and foolhardiness for a student preparing for a class presentation? Well, presumably what counts as courage in this case is not the same as what counts as courage, for example, for a soldier in war. The midpoint or balance of correct courage for a soldier fighting in a war is probably higher than for a student. As a result, what counts as a balance or proper midpoint for the student will be different than for the soldier when it comes to the virtue of courage. The mean is also relative to my individual character. Now let's consider the mean relative to the individual's character. Some students will be terrified of giving a presentation in class. They may find it the hardest thing that they have ever done, and doing so may take great courage for them. So in this case, because of the aspects of the individual person, giving a presentation may take much more courage for one student than for another. So what counts as a midpoint or balance of courage between foolhardiness and cowardice will be different depending on how much courage the action might take for me. In every situation, and for every person, the mean will always be between two extremes. But we must understand ourselves and our social situation before we can decide where the mean will be for us in each case. Aristotle admits that not every term has a mean which is a virtue. Consider murder, for example. Because murder is by definition wrongful killing, you cannot murder people just the right amount. But that should not be surprising, since murderousness is not a virtue. Similarly, we lack words or terms for some of the virtues. We did not, for example, have a simple word for taking the right amount of pleasure, but we can grasp the concept of it, and that is what matters for us here. Virtue is what the virtuous person would do. Aristotle provides us with a second way to see what virtue is. Virtue is what the virtuous person would do. There are at least two important aspects to this indication of how to define and identify virtue. The first important point is that, as we have already said, virtue has no mathematical rule that applies in all cases. For this reason, I must look at each situation individually and say, what would a virtuous person do here? The virtuous person, as Aristotle puts it, does the right thing in the right way at the right time and for the right reason. But only experience and practice in virtue can teach us how to do this. So paradoxically, we can only learn virtue by actually practicing virtue. We know it when we see it. A second aspect of the formulation that the virtuous act is the one that the virtuous person would do is closely related to this. If we can only learn how virtue applies to individual cases through experience, then we may mean we can only identify and understand virtue by seeing it in action. In other words, we may not really understand what virtue looks like until we see it. Sometimes I may understand it by seeing which of my own actions have a virtuous effect and which do not. But having virtuous teachers and virtuous role models is also especially important for Aristotle in learning what virtue is. Especially at a younger age, Aristotle believes that we must have virtuous role models to model for us the virtuous life. He has especially in mind parents and teachers. One way to think of this idea is through a popular slogan that many students had on bracelets and t-shirts a few years back. The slogan was WWJD, or What Would Jesus Do? The slogan was usually put forth without explanation, but an Aristotelian explanation might be implied here. The Christian Bible is full of commands and prohibitions. Why would we need to ask, what would Jesus do, if we already have all of those rules to follow? One way to understand this is to say that sometimes we can identify virtue easier by looking at virtuous character and saying, how would a virtuous person act? Because rules themselves can be hard to apply to specific situations. Students with a parent who they consider virtuous oftentimes say the same thing, that they ask themselves, what would my mother or father do in this situation? This may offer clarity for what a virtuous response would look like, even when there is no set moral rules which can apply to the situation. The virtuous act is done in the right way and for the right reason. You may notice a difficulty which comes from simply asking myself, what would a virtuous person do? We can find virtuous people who did things we probably shouldn't do, at least in many situations. Jesus was compassionate. He healed the sick and saved the life of a prostitute. But Jesus also overturned the tables of the money changers at the temple. If a student heard something that they didn't like in class, and so they started turning over tables and throwing chairs and said, Jesus did that, we probably would be unimpressed with their virtue. For this reason, the virtuous person, according to Aristotle, does the right thing in the right way and for the right reason. Similarly, we might do something which is supposedly doing the right thing, such as telling the truth, in the wrong way and for the wrong reason, and that would not be virtuous. For example, honesty is certainly a virtue, but if someone comes up to us and relentlessly tells us everything that they hate about us, and then simply says, I just want to be honest, we are again unlikely to be impressed with that person's virtue. In this case, we question if they did it in the right way. Surely there is a better way to help someone to become a better person than to berate and belittle them. And we also wonder if they did it for the right reason. Did they do it just out of spite and hurtfulness, or was it actually to help me? Virtuous actions come from habit and character. A last way of identifying the virtuous act that we will discuss here is that a virtuous act must come from my virtuous habit and character. Again, there are several important points contained here. One important point is that an act is only virtuous if I am a virtuous person, and I can only show that I am a virtuous person by consistently doing virtuous things. If I give money to someone in need one time, that does not make me a generous person. I am a generous person if I consistently help people when it is appropriate to do so. Virtue ethics, as we have already said, is concerned with my character and not just isolated moral choices. As such, we must be doing good consistently for it to truly be the result of an ethical and virtuous character. A second point here is that I must do a good action because I wanted to do it, because that is the kind of person I am. If I gave some money but did so grudgingly, then I am not truly a generous person. The generous person gives out of the character trait of generosity. As such, it will be their disposition to give whenever it is appropriate to do so. A theoretical story about Aristotle. So how does all this fit together into a story about how to live a real life and how to make decisions? And how would Aristotle himself have put the pieces together? The short story I am about to tell is not an historical account of Aristotle's life, but it is a fictional account of what all this might have looked like when linked in Aristotle's own life and experiences. And it can serve as an example when I ask you to apply these ideas to your own life experiences as we evaluate Aristotle's views. In this story, I will hit at all the main points we have covered below, intertwined with my fictional narrative, while relying on facts and historical stories from Aristotle's own life. Here's one way the story might go. Aristotle lived in Athens. With a son, he wanted to teach the good life. He wanted to learn how to be good for the sake of himself and his son. Living in Athens, he had freedom to do this in a way that many before him would not have had. So he asked himself, why do I do what I do? Is there a purpose to my life? He realizes that many things he does, like attaining money or power, do not have value in themselves. But happiness itself is a value for its own sake. Those people around him seeking pleasure and honor do not find happiness. So what does provide happiness? Aristotle sees that this cannot be answered scientifically, but there are things that experience can teach us about what it means to be happy. He finds he is fulfilled when he meets his unique purpose or ability, and that ability is reason. But reason alone isn't enough, because he is also an animal with animal needs. A well-reasoned life will teach him how to meet animal needs appropriately as well. Perhaps he thinks back to the courage of his teacher's teacher, Socrates, who bravely poisoned himself to death when the Athenian people demanded it. Is this the life he wants for himself and his son? No, perhaps he thinks, that went too far. A truly happy life involves moderation between being paralyzed by fearfulness and useless self-sacrifice. He knows he can learn something about the good life from finding virtuous teachers, so he studies under Plato's direction for many years. But he realizes that virtue is also relative to the individual. One person's answer to the good life will not look like another's, so he eventually separates from Plato to found his own school. Late in his life, we are told that the people of Athens wanted to kill Aristotle, as they had killed Socrates. Seeing courage as a virtue of moderation, Aristotle decides to refuse to relinquish his beliefs and to stand strong, but also to leave Athens so that he does not sacrifice himself and his family needlessly. Perhaps he meets with his students, establishes his legacy, and leaves with dignity, knowing that the virtuous person does the right thing in the right way, at the right time, and for the right reason. Let's further imagine that Aristotle dies an old man, living happily and fulfilled in another Greek city-state, happy to see his son Nicomachus grow up wise under his direction and protection. Hopefully you can see that we hit all the major points from our lecture on Aristotle, and hopefully you can see how they might tie together to give a consistent account of the good life.